Okay, good afternoon, everybody. You're very welcome to our December Brexit clinic, and it's a very special one as it's the last Brexit clinic of the transition period. We are using the webinar function of Zoom today, so if you have any questions for the panel, please pop them into the chat and we can monitor those as we go along. As is usual, we are recording the session this afternoon, so that will be available for download after this, and also the slides from the sessions and from our speakers this afternoon will be shared through our blog. So with no more from me, I'm going to pass over to David Finnemore, who's going to chair this afternoon's proceedings. Thank you.
Okay, thanks, Kevin. Welcome everybody to this latest of the Brexit clinics. Delighted to see such a good number of people with us today. I think when we advertised the Brexit clinic, I think about 10 days ago, I think our sincere hope was that we'd actually be talking in the light of knowledge of what the outcome of the UK-EU negotiations was. As you're probably all aware, those negotiations are still ongoing, and despite points that I've made in the past that they had to come to an end before the end of October, they clearly haven't. We are still in the midst of the negotiations, and we do not know exactly when they're going to conclude. Our hope is that they won't conclude before the end of this session, so that what we're actually saying to you is as up to date as we believe it to be. So anyway, as ever, plenty of things for us to discuss, and then hopefully get some questions that we can follow up on after we've had a number of presentations. Katie's with us today talking about what next for Northern Ireland. Vivian's here to talk about what next for the environment from the 1st of January in the context of Brexit. But as is normally the case, I'm going to kick off with some comments about the state of play with regard to the end of the transition period, and hopefully set the scene for what's going to be said subsequently. Okay, so as far as I'm concerned, the question I wanted to answer is, where are we with just over 2 weeks to go? Not a question I necessarily envisaged us asking, because clearly I think we all thought we would actually have a fairly clear sense of what was going to happen on the 1st of January, well before the last 2 weeks of December. That, though, is clearly not the case. There's plenty of unanswered questions still out there, and I think we obviously hope that we'll get more answers in the coming days. But if we think where we are, transition comes to an end at the end of this month, and that's when the UK will finally leave the EU's customs union, leave the EU internal market, all its various forms of cooperation and all its various programs. The one thing we do know about what will happen on the 1st of January is that, as you see on the left-hand side there, the protocol on Ireland, Northern Ireland, will come fully into force. So irrespective of what happens in the UK-EU relationship negotiations, the protocol comes into force. We'll say a little bit more about the protocol in a moment. In terms of the UK-EU negotiations on their future relationship, we still haven't got an answer to that question, deal or no deal. Will the UK be exiting the transition process period, rather, with a free trade agreement in place, and therefore free movement of goods will continue? Or will it be leaving the customs union, leaving the single market, and pursuing its trading relationship with the EU on what's generally referred to as WTO terms? There'll be no deal in place. We do not know the answer to that question. It seems quite absurd that we're 2 weeks out from the end of the transition period and we don't know the answer to that question. Okay, so going to talk a little bit about the implementation of the protocol, where I think it's fair to say some good progress has been made over the last 10 days. Very late in the process, but nevertheless, progress is there. A bit more clarity around, and then say a few words about the negotiations, where they are, and what next for them. Okay, in terms of the implementation of the protocol, I think last week was quite a significant week insofar as we at last got some agreements in principle between the UK and the EU on a number of issues to do with the implementation. And those have been set out with a fair amount of government spin, I think it's fair to say, in the command paper, which was issued last Thursday, I think it was, on the Northern Ireland Protocol. the command paper covers a range of decisions and arrangements which the UK and the EU have reached agreement in principle on. Basically, last week, Michael Gove and Maroš Šefčovič, the EU Commissioner responsible for the implementation of the protocol, met, lengthy meeting, and they reached agreement on the following issues. 4 draft decisions for the Joint Committee on tariffs and goods not at risk of onward movement into the EU internal market, having originated in GB, the level of permissible subsidies for agriculture and fisheries under the protocol, arrangements for the monitoring of the implementation of the protocol by EU officials in Northern Ireland, and then there's also a decision coming through on the number of errors and omissions, and also, quite intriguingly, the removal of two EU acts from the coverage of the protocol. What we've then got is an interesting set of declarations which have been adopted by either the UK or the EU, of which the other side takes note. So these concern export declarations, export health certificates, and arrangements for prohibited and restricted products, essentially meat products moving GB NI. The UK adopted some declarations and the EU took note of them. And then the EU issued some declarations on implementation of the relevant medicines acquis, and also state aid arrangements and the definition of, or the interpretation of Article 10, and the UK took note of those. Important because declarations have no legal force in the EU. They are simply political declarations. Katie's going to say a bit more about some of these issues in due course, but I think just to note, though, that the decisions remain draft. They have to be signed off by the EU and then adopted formally by the Joint Committee. We're not too sure when that Joint Committee is going to be meeting, but our understanding is that those decisions will be signed off by the EU tomorrow. Okay, so that brings us to a certain amount of clarity around arrangements from the 1st of January for Northern Ireland under the protocol, although there remain quite a few questions unanswered, and Katie will pick up on some of those. In terms of the UK-EU negotiations, we know we still haven't got a deal. We're not too sure whether the UK will leave the transition period on a no deal basis. Next few days, I would hope, will provide some clarity around that. I think it's fair to say that the slight increase in optimism over the last 24 hours, because there seems to be agreement, at least in principle, on the level playing field arrangements, which have bedeviled the negotiations for so much of the last number of months. And you can see there headlines from, I think, Financial Times last night and the Irish Times today, indicating that, okay, they're on a narrow path towards a deal. The fisheries question still has to be addressed. Whether it will be or not, it remains to be seen, because obviously it's a very, very contentious issue. But I think that generally sort of reading what the media are saying, what officials are saying, that's probably something that where a deal can be struck. So as ever, I think I'm half glass full person on this one. But that said, we could all be proven wrong in the coming days. Fact of the matter is, 1st of January 2021 is coming. It's coming fast, and it's probably the most honest piece of government publicity of the whole process. They've got up, time is running out, as one of their key lines at the moment, and pleading with businesses in particular to prepare. Difficult when you still don't know exactly what's going to be happening on the 1st of January. So, okay. What I wanted to say is final slide is just look at what might be in a deal. I think one thing we've yet to see is real detail of what's been tentatively agreed, at least. But certainly if we look at what the UK set out to achieve, then what you have on the left-hand side is an indication of sort of the areas which we expect to see in the deal, assuming agreement is reached. We're told there's about 700 pages worth of text plus annexes. And the reason for that is that it covers quite a significant range of issues. And you've got them listed there. Whereas we're all talking about free trade and level playing field, and we're also talking about fish. There's other issues there which are going to be part of the arrangements, assuming they're agreed: aviation, energy, nuclear cooperation, participation in EU programs, although some of you may have seen today indications that the UK may not be part of Erasmus, obviously a concern for us at Queen's. Judicial cooperation in criminal matters, issues around asylum and illegal immigration, data adequacy, civil judicial cooperation. Okay, so it's going to be quite a wide-ranging agreement, but the substance we're still to see. Okay, so negotiations are ongoing. One of the issues which is really occupying minds at the moment is, okay, if you get an agreement, how on earth do you actually give it formal approval so that it can come into force on the 1st of January? If you think back to the timelines we've been talking about all this year, we were indicating that the agreement really had to be reached by the end of October, because you then had to translate what had been agreed. You had to ensure that it was what they call scrubbed, so that it was legally secure, that there weren't any mistakes in it. You then had to send it off to the European Parliament for approval. It had to be sent off to the member states so that they could review it before the council took a decision. You'd have to have a ratification process in the UK Parliament. And the expectation was that you really need 2 months for that process. We're now down to 2 weeks, and we still haven't got even a draft text to be circulating between the institutions and the member states. Okay, so begs the question, how are you going to get approval, and what's the process involved? For the EU side, what's really going to be important is whether this is a pure EU agreement, one which can be signed off by the EU Council, having got the consent of Parliament, or whether it's going to contain some elements which go beyond the competences of the EU and is therefore would therefore be what we refer to as a mixed agreement, and require not just the sign-off of the Council and the Parliament, but also member state ratification. And we're still not too sure what the situation is going to be on this. Okay, let's assume that it's going to be an EU agreement, a straight EU agreement. Then we need a recommendation coming from the Commission to go to the Council. The Council would then arrange for signature. At the same time, it would go to the Parliament for its consent. And assuming that Parliament gives its consent, then the Council would take the decision to conclude. And then from the EU side, at least, the process is complete and the agreement could come into force. Okay, the question is whether there's enough time to do that. And mindful of the fact that we're in the second day of the last plenary session of the European Parliament of 2020. And although the Parliament has indicated that it could reconvene on, I think, the 28th of December, that's still arguably not enough time to get the agreement scrubbed, to get it translated, and to have any meaningful scrutiny of it by MEPs. Okay, so what there is talk about at the moment is whether there could be provisional application, that the UK and the EU could say, look, we'll complete the formal ratification process in due course, but for the moment, we'll have provisional application of certain elements from the 1st of January. That will be for the Commission to recommend, that will be for the Council to decide. Chances are this is probably going to be the way forward if there is an agreement. On the question of member state ratification, that is something which could follow in 2021 if it's required, on the basis of provisional application of the agreement. So there are ways forward here in terms of getting the agreement approved such that it could come into force on the 1st of January next year. I think there are legitimate concerns here about the very limited time that is being given to scrutiny. In terms of the UK, a much simpler process, partly because the UK government has a large majority in Parliament, and also I think the broad view within Parliament is that the UK does not want to leave without a deal. Cabinet would need to agree, Parliament would need to approve, but the normal arrangements, so-called CRAG process, could be bypassed. Parliament would need to adopt implementing legislation, but that's something which could be done relatively straightforward manner. The politics around that is not particularly complex. Okay, so there is a way forward. It would require additional sittings, but if there is a deal, then we can probably see some form of approval for at least provisional application before the end of the year. The alternative is the UK leaves with no deal. Obviously, that would not need to be ratified. That would simply become a fact on the 1st of January. If that does occur, well, we'll see what that's going to bring. I think Kate's going to talk through some of the practical implications of that in due course. Meantime, yeah, time. everybody's up against time on this one, and it'll be very interesting to see what's going to be happening over the next couple of weeks and whether there will be a deal. And then if there isn't, what's going to be happening on the 1st of January. So I'm going to stop there, and I think over to Katie.
Thanks very much, David. I'll just get my slides up. Oh dear, that's what I was hoping wouldn't happen. Okay, so what comes next for Northern Ireland? Well, as you're aware, we had good news last week and some significant progress being made, as David has mentioned, in relation to the protocol. So I'm just going to outline just the headlines in relation to that, and then talk a little bit more about what to expect, particularly sort of for citizens, come the 1st of January. So a lot of the concern, of course, around the implementation of the protocol is focused on the movement of goods, although, of course, the protocol covers many other issues. And basically, the two elements that are covered by the agreement in principle last week are movements from NI to GB and from GB to NI. So bearing in mind, of course, that movements from NI to and from the EU remain as they are at the moment. So in relation to NI to GB, now we know that at the beginning of last week, which seems an age ago, but anyway, beginning of last week, the UK government reiterated its threats to put in the internal market bill a means by which it could legislate unilaterally to deal with this question of export declarations of goods going from NI to GB. What it claims in its command paper is that there won't be now, they've agreed with the EU, that there won't be export or exit summary declarations on goods going from NI to GB. This hasn't explicitly been waived by the EU, and what they have instead is this agreement that there will be very close monitoring of what's crossing, and that that data will be shared with relevant authorities. So we can expect information to be gathered on those movements, and especially that will become more important, sort of increasingly significant if there is a no deal, of course, because of the risk of people trying to evade customs procedures, tariffs on goods going to GB. But anyway, we basically will see minimal change in theory anyway on the 1st of January on that particular movement. And an important aspect in relation to this is that the UK Internal Market Bill, even as it stands with those clauses in, and as the amendments have been made by the House of Lords, that part of that is about unfettered access and meaningful access, if you like, so that NI goods won't be discriminated against in GB. Then we come to GB to NI movements of goods. So as we've been saying for a very long time, since the beginning of this protocol, customs and other sorts of declarations will be needed on goods moving from GB into NI come the 1st of January. The Trader Support Service is meant to enable registered businesses in Northern Ireland to manage this and to make those declarations. And people are still being very much encouraged to sign up to that service as a matter of urgency. What news we had last week is that there'll be a new trader scheme, a trusted trader scheme. And this is particularly to deal with this question of at-risk goods. So it's basically trying to avoid that becoming a barrier to movement of goods from GB into NI, even in the event of a no deal. And authorised traders, which will include small traders as well as large ones, will be able to use this scheme in order to move goods into NI without having to pay tariffs in advance. And we are seeing, pretty rapidly more information being put up on the gov.uk website in relation to what that entails and what it's going to look like. And then we had something that's not called a pink fluffy bunny period. It's more specifically an adaptation period, if you like, in relation to those two things that we were most worried about. So that is medicines and movement of food. So there's a 12-month adaptation period for medicine supply. And notably, this is to allow for readjustment of those supply chains. So NI supplies will be coming directly from the EU in the future to avoid regulatory barriers. And then in relation to agri-food, so the UK is making a commitment to remain fully aligned to union law that in effect reassures the EU that it can go light touch in these two particular areas. So one is on SPS rules for the first 3 months. And instead of an export health certificate, which we've heard a lot of concern about, of course, authorized traders will just be able to use an official certificate, which should be much more simple. But bear in mind, this is just for 3 months. That all changes on the 1st of April. And then in relation to meat products, again, there's been a lot of speculation around sausages, etc. They can continue to enter Northern Ireland from GB for 6 months, but afterwards, after that point, the expectation is that those they will be sourced instead from the EU. Okay, so where things stand amid it all, when we're focusing particularly on the protocol, is obviously we're just talking whatever 10 working days or something to the end of the transition period, and there are still many questions and concerns in particular around whether the systems that are there to help implement the protocol will be fully functional, and quite how many teething problems we're likely to have with these new schemes. And rapid progress is being made. Certainly the direction of travel is to fully implement the protocol, but no doubt there'll be many bumps in the road before it's operating smoothly. There are also a lot of unknowns. I would expect, especially if we get news on a deal, a sort of a rake of information to be coming forward from the government in relation to specific queries that have been asked, such as in relation to parcels, which is still unknown. But that will be sort of last minute information and require rapid adjustment too. We need to bear in mind too that 2021 was always going to be challenging, but now those adaptation periods will feel pretty tight. And the EU will be monitoring, of course. It will be present to ensure the implementation of the protocol. So these are real deadlines, and even those grace periods and those specific things, they'll seem to go pretty fast, and the adjustment will need to be taken very seriously. And then the question of a no deal, well, even with these reassurances around the protocol being implemented, so at least you have more certainty on that front. We shouldn't underestimate quite how significant a no deal would be. It would have an impact on GB to NI movement, not as much as it might have done without that trader scheme. But if you think of the complexity of that integration and the wider impact of on GB of a no deal, we can see how that will no doubt affect Northern Ireland very seriously. And although we will, as I say, have that free movement of goods still between Northern Ireland and the EU, there are many other issues, as David has mentioned there, that would be covered by a deal and would be very, very important. So if we don't have that deal, then we have all sorts of knock-on effects, in particular around the exchange of data, that would very much have an impact on the island of Ireland. And then my last slide, sorry for the amount of information on my slides today, but so just to give a little bit of practical information about what happens come the 1st of January. So traveling in the EU first and foremost, so freedom of movement will be retained for those holding Irish passports. But from the 1st of January, British passport holders, if they're entering the EU, not Ireland, but the rest of the EU 26, will need to have at least six months left on their passports and enter through a non-EEA lane. And this new scheme, the ETIAS scheme, will it's a sort of an entry scheme, such as the one you have to use to go to Canada or the US. To sign up to that, that'll be needed from the end of 2022. And also, unless we see something arranged for it in the deal, which is unlikely, British citizens will need a visa to stay more than 3 months or to engage in paid work in the EU. And this has a knock-on effect for services. Driving, you need a green card for insurance, driving in the EU, and an international driving permit. In relation to health, the Irish government in its Brexit omnibus bill is committed to cover all eligible residents in Northern Ireland for something equivalent to European health insurance card to be able to access emergency healthcare abroad. And then in relation to study, again, the Irish government has indicated that it will, if needs be, if there isn't something in a deal, that it will arrange for some way by which students in NI universities can continue to have access to Erasmus or similar schemes. And study visas, though, may be required for British citizens. And then on the island of Ireland, the biggest change comes for EU 26 workers. So those from, obviously, from EU member states that aren't Ireland, then there is a need to apply for settled status prior to 1st of July in order to benefit from all the, to retain the current rights. A frontier worker permit will be needed after that point for those EU 26 workers living on the southern side of the border who are working in Northern Ireland. And if NI employers want to employ new EU workers after the 1st of January, then they'll need a sponsorship license to do that. For driving, in theory, we should all now have a green card for motor insurance if we're crossing the border. In relation to health, the treatment abroad scheme, the cross-border directive, won't apply for people in the south wanting to access elective surgery in or treatment in Northern Ireland. Another big effect will be in relation to mobile phone roaming, so that won't be guaranteed from the 1st of January. So phone service providers, if they want to, can add to the calls and price of calls and texts to and from the EU. So there's a particular concern, of course, in the border region. And then in relation to services, I mentioned that there are some help, there's some help through the fact of the existence of the common travel area, but we're yet to see the kind of detail and reassurance, particularly around recognition of qualifications that would help in relation to movement of services if we don't have a UK-EU deal. And another concern in relation to this is the exchange of data and how that could happen in the event of a no deal and indeed in the absence of a EU adequacy decision in relation to the UK's data protection. All of these will be have a very detrimental impact on the movement of services on the island of Ireland and from NI to the rest of the EU. And I'll hand it over to Vivian now.
Okay, thank you very much. I will try sharing my screen as well. Yes, so we're going to move from goods to the environment, but I hope you'll see that there's actually quite a lot of common themes emerging from David's, Katie's, and I talk. In many ways, we are in this very odd process where it looks like we're still discussing things that have, that we've been discussing for the last 4 years, and yet we're both at the same time completely repeating ourselves all the time, and yet running out of time, which is an interesting situation to be in. Now, just very quickly, what changes for the environment on the 1st of January 2021 for the environment in Northern Ireland? What we're going to have is an apparent regulatory status quo, but that is actually going to, if you start digging a bit into this, you see there's going to be 2 types of formally EU environmental rules in Northern Ireland. These are included in the protocol, in the Annex 2 to the protocol, and there's about 20 environmental pieces of legislation there. And these will be directly applicable EU law in Northern Ireland. And for example, REACH, so the regulation on chemicals, but also rules around the shipment of waste, rules around eco-labeling of energy efficiency in dishwasher, for example, all of that will still be directly applicable. Most of environmental law, though EU environmental law, will be retained EU law that has been amended so that you remove the reference to film of the European Commission, you put a reference to the department here, and that covers issues such as water, habitat protection, and all that. So if you look at DERA has done a really good job in terms of informing, having a very up-to-date website in terms of the EU exit pages. If you look at what they're saying around habitats protection, for example, they're very clear. There is no change of policy. There is no change of responsibility. If you're a site manager, you still have to handle the site the same way. It will still be recognized as a European site. It's completely different thinking, though, if we're looking at governance. And this is because we are in this kind of in-between world. The regulatory picture is quite clear. The governance picture is much less clear. You're going to have, of course, the end of the jurisdiction of the European Commission, the Court of Justice, but you can see here I've got some caveats coming, and a new domestic system, the Office for Environmental Protection. The problem is, of course, that that end of jurisdiction of the Commission and the Court of Justice does not, of course, apply to these rules that are included in the protocol. So we're going to have a role for the Commission and the Court of Justice for some of the environmental rules applicable to Northern Ireland, but not for most of them. Now, you could still have some kind of role for the Commission and the Court of Justice on the rules that are now only just retained EU law, as long as the infringement took place before the end of the transition period. Now, in the EU system, though, the Commission has to decide whether, on the basis of whether it's politically sensible to do so, or how bad the infringement is, to pursue a case or not. Now, it appears to me that it would be quite unlikely that the Commission would decide to pick up cases in the UK that took place, for example, during the transition period, unless there were egregious cases and unless the tensions between the two parties got really out of hand. Now, the problem is that, so we have some kind of uncertainty around the role of the Commission and Court of Justice, the scope, and what they're going to be doing. We also have a lot more uncertainty on the domestic front and the development of the Office for Environmental Protection, because the ambition and timing and even remit of the OEP is still very uncertain. So this needs to be done after the 1st of January. We need to set up the Office for Environmental Protection in England and potentially in Northern Ireland. There's currently ongoing debates on the Environmental Bill in Westminster. The Environment Bill, if you remember Queen's speech before, so last fall, like before the 2019 election, the Environment Bill was presented by Boris Johnson as the lodestar of his parliamentary agenda. This was like the centerpiece. This was supposed to be the big thing, and it's been repeatedly pushed back. It was supposed to lead to this kind of gold standard of the UK as this big environmental leader. Now, the issue there, of course, is that if you look at the debates currently, because the bill is finally, after months and months, back in the Commons, it looks like DEFRA is adding some amendments that will further weaken the OEP. So we're moving even further from this kind of gold standard. And this goes back to the issue around accountability and who's taking back control. And here we're seeing that actually this OEP, so the role of the Office for Environmental Protection is to kind of make sure that the government actually delivers on the environmental aims it has set itself. Yet the government would be able to judge, to indicate what it considers serious or non-serious breaches, and the OEP can only investigate serious breaches. So there's a lot of debate around the recent amendments, and we're still not sure whether the OEP is actually going to have any bite or not. Now, that's the OEP for England, but similar rules should apply for whether if Northern Ireland opts in to join it. There's a new consultation that has been out last week and open until the 5th of February on how this, the OEP and transitional arrangements may work for Northern Ireland. I mentioned transitional arrangements because the OEP won't be ready at least until July. So we need to avoid this kind of big gap in our governance to have some kind of setup in between. This is an interesting public discussion document, definitely, and it does tell you, it reminds us all that, of course, the Assembly wasn't there when the first discussions around the OEP were put in. So the suggestions on how Northern Ireland should join in the OEP were drafted by civil servants, and now it is our time as stakeholders, as citizens, to engage with this discussion before there's a decision by the Minister and by the Assembly on whether Northern Ireland should actually join in the OEP. Okay, that's hopefully shortly after the 1st of January. After that, once we're done with dealing with all the mess of being ready for that Brexit day and for that end of transition period, we need to take, well, potentially a break, but then start reflecting on what fell and is falling through the cracks. There's been a lot of retained EU law that was agreed in haste, modified in haste, and that leads to opportunity for weakening ambition in practice. If you change the frequency of the reporting duties, for example, if you change who you report to, there's lots of different ways in which apparent cleaning up of existing EU law so that it became kind of retained EU law, changing reference, we need, whether that's been done on purpose or not, can have a weakened in practice policy. There's been studies already done in the SIs agreed for England that showed there's been a case of this, and we need to do more work on whether that's also been the case in the rest of the UK. We know that common frameworks are running behind schedule, and these especially have been put a lot in the really discussed a lot because of the debates around the internal market bill. Now, whether common frameworks are actually going to solve the internal market bill issue is another matter. But what we do know is that there's going to be very limited time for stakeholder involvement, even though the departments are trying. And that means that, big changes to the nitty-gritty of environmental law is happening with limited time for involvement, even if the department wanted to get that involvement, which and that means there's going to be issues, there's going to be errors, there's going to be big problems that we will not have been able to catch before they become law. So that's the kind of bad side of things, perhaps. But then you have this idea of, we're going to have to manage as well that divergence, intra-UK and UK-EU divergence. There's been a lot of discussion around level playing field and this idea of ratchet or dynamic alignment. Now, of course, there's a difference between these two, right? Dynamic alignment is if one party, the EU or the UK, is more ambitious, then the other has to follow suit. Ratchet means, if both have become more ambitious, then that creates a new baseline. Now, whether we end up with one or the other in the deal, it says a deal, I find it extremely interesting that the discussion for now have always been about there's the UK, there's the EU. Of course, if you consider the environment, and the environment is actually one of the areas in which this level playing field discussion is so important. We've got three different policies. Scotland, Wales, Northern Ireland, and England have actually different standards and can develop different standards in the future. And so if we end up with a ratchet or dynamic alignment clauses in the deal, it's going to be interesting to see whether part of the UK, but not England, acting in a certain way will actually be sufficient to trigger any of these clauses or not, or whether it will have to be the four nations acting as one, because we know this is not happening for now. So there's a lot of question on what role for Northern Ireland will there be in this, because Northern Ireland has this kind of past of really not being an environmental leader, but more really kind of a laggard. So we're seeing though that there is an option actually for Northern Ireland, because it is bound by the protocol, to be leading the way, at least on some areas. So we're seeing, for example, there's been a vote in the European Parliament to kind of an agreement to ban lead shots, so that there's no environmental contamination, water contamination issues from this. And this, of course, has a big impact on the hunting sector, but this would have to apply to Northern Ireland because REACH is part of the Annex 2 protocol, but it would not also apply to GB for now. But Northern Ireland could then actually, push, try to get this on a common frameworks, try to advocate for the fact that it is a good policy that GB should follow it as well. So we're going to see some very interesting dynamics potentially with Northern Ireland potentially trying to lead in some areas, if it has to raise its standards to keep pace with the EU, then perhaps the rest of the UK should. But in areas where it is not bound by the EU specific protocol, might actually try to drag things down, which could then lead to interesting development with any either a ratchet or a dynamic clause. And that's it for me.
Okay, thanks very much, Vivian. Thanks, Katie. We now turn to questions, and I think we've encouraged you to put those in the chat. I see there are a number there already, and we'll come to those. But if there are other ones, please do write them up or signal that. Yeah, please do put them in the chat, and we'll come to them. I think we can start at the top. Pet passports. I look to Katie as a dog owner. Do you know what the situation is, Katie?
Yes, so this is a really good question, and I've tripped up on it in the past when I was trying to look into it. From what I understand, we should already have pet passports if we're moving our animals, my 3 dogs, across the border. That should already be the case. What the protocol means is that we don't need to change anything in that regard. Now, what happens as a result of the protocol and as a result of Brexit is that things will change on moving pets across the Irish Sea. And so because in Northern Ireland, we can continue to have those pet passports, which of course we already have for animals. We're okay, but in GB, if you have a pet passport, you have to change that. That won't be recognised anymore as being valid in the EU or in Northern Ireland. So for moving pets from GB into NI after the 1st of January, you have to have an official certificate issued by a vet to confirm that your pet has the necessary vaccinations against rabies and tapeworm, etc. And that certificate will need to accompany you when you're bringing your pet from GB into NI. And when you bring your pet into NI, it would have to come into certain designated points of entry, i.e. Larne or Belfast Port. For pets moving from NI into GB, that's the same as it is now, for the time being anyway. But if you're bringing your pet back from GB into NI, again, you'll have to come through those designated points of entry. And it's worth noting that this is just for non-commercial movements. So it's even more laborious if you have, for example, if you're rehoming, if you've bought a puppy in GB and you're wanting to bring it into Northern Ireland, that'll be different.
If I can just add something on this around the movement of people, of course, because especially if there's no deal, I mean, currently the European Union bans most citizens from third countries to enter the EU due to its COVID restrictions to travel. There are very few countries that are not on that list. And if the list is not changed on the 1st of January, UK citizens won't be able to enter the EU, of course, apart from Ireland. So this is actually coming very quickly. And so I think the mix of COVID rules and restrictions plus deal or no deal, I would assume in a deal case, this list may be changed to include the EU. In a no deal case, I'm not sure that the EU member states would be very quick to act. And then you would only have to have only very limited reasons to allow people to actually go to the continent.
Thanks for that. There's 2 or 3 questions here to do with tariffs and trade. I hope you can see them, Katie. There's one there around credits and machine transfers. I think my immediate response was check with the government website on that one, but let you come in on that. And also there's one further down about how tariffs that are paid, how will they be paid if they are required? And then Katie, if you want to give your view on what that midnight on the 1st of January or midnight on the 31st of December will look like in Northern Ireland.
Yes, so on the very technical question about machine supplied GBNI and the Republic, I would just advise, like the NI Business Info would be able to give specialized advice on that, or indeed Intertrade Ireland. So I'd recommend going to them. I wouldn't presume to try and answer that important question. And how tariffs will be paid. So there's a little bit of ambiguity, you won't be surprised to hear, around the Trader Support Service, whether it's compulsory or not. But I think it's definitely the case that all businesses in NI who are importing or bringing goods in from GB are strongly urged to sign up to the Trader Support Service. And it's through that means that, as far as I understand, as far as I understand it, given that it's changed slightly recently, but the declarations will be made and then the tariffs will be paid through that. They will manage that. But I mean, the good news from last week is that I should stress, that they are really expecting very few instances where tariffs will have to be paid, even in a no deal. I mean, the definition of goods at risk has been clarified to try and, make it as wide as possible, I should say. So if those goods are staying in the UK, that tariffs won't be paid. We're still to see the details of the rebate system for those few goods relating to authorized traders that may be seen as being potentially at risk. We haven't seen that rebate system yet, but that will be a big aspect of making that system work. And as regards what happens on the 1st of January, I mean, the truth is that we've got several new systems that are being established to manage the movement of goods from GB to NI. The Customs Declaration Service hasn't been used in this way before. The Goods Vehicle Movement System hasn't been used before. The Trader Support Service is new. The UK Trader Scheme is new. The Movement Assistance Scheme is new. So, I mean, and all of these are using IT. So we just know that there's going to be challenges. Many of them haven't been beta tested yet even. So I think that a lot of investment is being put in that Trader Support Service. And I noticed that the deadline for signing up to the UK Trader Service is the 31st of December. So essentially, although, it's important to recognize that things will have changed on the 1st of January, especially crossing the Irish Sea, that if you do, as is being advised with regards to signing up to the Trader Support Service, and getting the XI EORI number, then you will be on the right side and doing the right thing as much as possible. But I mean, the best thing is just to try and keep up to date on the gov.uk website, sign up to those updates and just search them for every reference to Northern Ireland.
Okay, Vivian, got any views on what's going to happen at midnight on the 31st of December?
Going to be a mess. Yeah, I mean, I think what Katie's saying in terms of there's been a lot of effort put in developing a lot of IT systems that traders will be discovering as they go, and that I think will not be. We're still having a lot of, every time we're hearing from customs officials, for example, in the House of Commons coming to give evidence, we're hearing different numbers of expected amount of paperwork that they assume are going to be needed. So I think the actual volume that will have to go through these channels. Now we're a bit more reassured with the agreement last week, but I think it's a system that is not going to work well, because at least at first, because it hasn't been tested, and it's a lot of people who are not used to having to do that kind of paperwork that we'll have to do. So of course the bigger companies who can have staff that is purely dedicated to this will fare better, and the smaller company will have a bit more time, will struggle for a bit longer, which is why the adaptation period is so necessary. But even with the adaptation period, even with the agreement in principle last week, it's still going to be very messy, and we can expect some disruption, although less disruption than we would have expected without that agreement, and of course more disruption if there's no deal.
Okay, thanks. Got a question in there, a very practical question around buying a good in Paris with a value of 200 euros. Will it be subject to customs duties, VAT, etc., coming into Northern Ireland? Katie?
So it won't be, no, it won't, customs duties won't apply, and the rules for VAT will be the same as they are now.
Yeah, yes, I think, but broadly, essentially any existing movement of goods between the EU and Northern Ireland should remain unaffected on the 1st of January. That's what the protocol delivers. It's obviously different if those goods are coming into GB. That's going to be determined by whether there's an agreement or not put in place, and what the terms of that will be. Okay. Okay, there's a couple of questions there about university fees and Erasmus. I think I made the comment that there's been an indication that the UK may not be getting Erasmus. I think, Jeff, you asked whether there's possibility of negotiations afterwards. Yes, I think whatever's decided in the next couple of weeks, it will not necessarily be definitive. There can always be negotiations on the future, and if we do end up with no deal, I think a lot of the issues on which there have been negotiations will be returned to in due course. Clearly, though, the context will be different, and also one would think that some of the political fallout of any no deal and the collapse of the negotiations will be lingering for quite some time. On the question of fees for people with Irish passports in GB, my understanding is that under the terms of the Common Travel Area, or at least in the spirit of the Common Travel Area, the fees, that Irish passport holders will not be charged higher fees than GB and English students. Those will apply. It would be different if you're coming from outside of the UK and Ireland. And there, I think the decisions are going to be left to the different universities themselves. We've seen some universities agreeing to maintain domestic fees. Others will be charging international fees. Okay. There's a question there about UKIM, the UK Internal Market Bill, and ping pong. I don't know, Katie, Vivian, do you want to take that one?
I don't see there being. I'd be surprised if yeah. I mean, maybe I'm being optimistic, but I think I think the appetite for ping pong is kind of diminished. I mean, the big issues around. I mean, there's many issues related to the Internal Market Bill, but I suspect the government's priority will be having that bill rather than engaging in more back and forth with the Lords. But I stand to be corrected on that one.
Okay.
And just to add to that, we're seeing, so the main issue now remaining with it is a tension between kind of devolved administration and central government in terms of whether the UK Internal Market Bill, as it stands, allow the devolved administration to meaningfully exercise their competence. So whether they will be able to diverge in a way that affects to all the products sold on their market or just their own producers. And so, for example, whether the Welsh government can ban more single-use plastic items than England, and whether English trader can then still sell these banned single-use plastics on Welsh supermarket shelves or not. And that's an issue that is very problematic for all the devolved administration. And we are seeing that the Welsh Senate, for example, has withheld consent of the bill. This is not the first time. There's been lots of Brexit bills that have passed despite the devolved administration withholding consent. So I think we're going to see more of this. And it's very interesting to see that if you look at the debates in the Commons, you're hearing from Conservative MPs to say, you know, we know that this bill is good for devolution, it's good for the UK because the SNP is against this bill. Now, this is very problematic as a reading because while you might accuse, of course, the SNP of wanting, you know, Scottish independence, that's kind of their goal, the fact that the Welsh Senate is very strongly as well opposed, even though the Welsh have been trying to make this work, have been trying to make common frameworks work, have been trying to deliver Brexit in a way that make, you know, the devolution system work better. The fact that they're strongly opposed to this bill is really bad sign for the bill and really bad sign for the kind of intra-UK governmental relations that we need to be able to deliver in terms of any kind, managing any kind of divergence. So I would assume that what we're going to get is perhaps some very minor changes there, just to allow it through, potentially a few more exemptions for to the principles of non-discrimination, for example. But actually, it's still going to be a bill that the Devolver administration are very unhappy with, and it's going to fester a really bad relationship. It's just going to get worse.
Hey, thanks again. Thanks, Katie. A couple of other questions in there. There's one about professional qualifications and mutual recognition. That's not covered in the terms of the protocol. That's something which the outcome to which we're going to have to see in the UK-EU negotiations, whether that's been being covered or not. I think there was some suggestion that if it's not covered in the UK-EU agreement, then there might be something which can be done on a bilateral UK-Ireland basis under some provisions associated with the protocol. But that will, I think, follow, if possible, from the outcome of the negotiations between the UK and the EU. There's a couple of questions, Michelle, on what preparations Ireland have undertaken, given that some goods will continue to be routed to the single market in terms of rule of origin, SPS, etc. I don't know, Katie, whether you could say anything on that. And then we've also got the question about what's happening to aviation and energy. That will obviously be determined by the future UK-EU relationship. If there is no deal, the EU, the Commission has certainly put forward some contingency plans for aviation and road transport. I'm not too sure that it's included energy in what is being put forward at the moment. I don't know, Katie, do you want to come in on this?
Yes, just in terms of Ireland's preparations, I'm not quite sure the exact meaning of the question, but I mean, goods moving from Ireland into GB will obviously be crossing that customs border, and although GB, it's not even in a state to fully implement its border policy by any means, in the future, you'll have to go through the SPS checks, etc. in Holyhead. It's not ready for that yet, and it's got its own implementation period of 6 months. And there are special arrangements for Ireland, Irish hauliers going to the EU and crossing the land bridge. But in terms of Ireland being prepared for goods coming in from GB into Irish ports, it is prepared for that, including for SPS checks. I'll go from NI to, thanks Michelle, go from NI to Ireland. We see nothing's changed, so there's no change in the movement of goods between Northern Ireland and Ireland, or Northern Ireland and the EU. The change would be Northern Ireland to the EU via the land bridge of GB, and the need transit then to be used to be able to just have that, frictionless access into the EU. So hope that answers your question. Okay.
Okay, we've got another question in here about export bans. Where the EU has an export ban or restrictions in place for a particular product, will NI producers be subject to that ban if the UK does not have a ban in place? My understanding is yes. The provisions do apply to Northern Ireland under the protocol. I don't know if everyone's got anything else to say on that.
No, and again, I mean, there's a possibility if the EU adds a ban to something, it has a new ban, then, and it's seen as being relevant to the protocol, given scope of the protocol, then the EU would notify the UK through the bodies of the overseeing the implementation of the protocol, and then it would be for the joint committee, which is the UK-EU committee overseeing the withdrawal agreement, to make a decision on whether that ban should be incorporated into the protocol and applied in Northern Ireland. And if they can't agree on that, because it takes two sides to agree, even though we hope get better agreement by this time, then the EU can take remedial measures. So that can be in all sorts of things. So yes, if a ban doesn't already apply and the EU increases has new restrictions, then they may well apply to Northern Ireland in the future, which I think underlines the fact that, you know, the protocol is like a dynamic, a living document, and we should begin to think of it as the environment within which Northern Ireland's economy and regulatory conditions will be developed in the coming years. It's not just about what happens on the 1st of January or the 1st of April. It's very much the sort of, this is a new world in which we live.
Okay.
And just to add to that, I think, I mean, one of the big questions around bans is, of course, if there's new EU bans, or if it's the UK, of course, removes like bans, pre-existing EU bans. That it's one of the big areas where that could be the case, of course, would be around GMOs in food, where we know that at least the UK government and England more generally are much less opposed to GMOs than the devolved administrations. So you could then have big tension there, of course, with potentially then lifting that ban for GB against the wishes of Wales and Scotland, but that ban would not be able to be lifted for Northern Ireland. And so increasing the number and the issues around checks, GB to NI, to ensure that GMOs that should not be on the NI and EU market do not get there if there's a lifting of that ban in GB. Mm-hmm. So it's all about these very connected parts that, you know, if you start changing rules in one part of it, it's going to have impact on Northern Ireland as well.
I think that flags one of the big challenges in the months and years ahead about how we keep an eye on all these potential implications of both what the UK is doing and what the EU is doing for Northern Ireland's position, both within the access to the internal market of the EU, but also its position within the UK internal market. So yeah, it's a protocol creates a framework, the consequences of which we will be seeing unfold in the coming months and coming years. Okay, there are a couple more references in there to very specific trade questions and the TSS, and I think there's also a point made about how long it can take to get your EORI number. I think just reiterate what Katie was saying earlier, register, and the sooner the better for that, which is obviously the government's guidelines at the moment. And I don't know whether, Katie, you've got anything else to add on those TSS related questions and in terms of paperwork associated with the movement of goods. But I think the default position here is contact the TSS. They'll be the ones who'll be able to advise on this. And if they don't know at the moment, hopefully they will know by the end of this month. I think, yes, we're in a situation where there are still so many unanswered questions and so many questions that cannot be answered because detail is still to be worked out. Okay, I think we've covered all the questions which I can see in the chat. Happy to take some other ones if people want to put any more through. But I think if I could just pick up on a couple of things that were said towards the end there. I think Katie referenced it, it's a living dynamic protocol. The arrangements will change over time and they have to be implemented. So there's a big challenge ahead in terms of monitoring, in terms of making sure Northern Ireland's voice is inputted into that process, at a point that we've made it in the past. But also I think we can't lose sight of the fact that in 2024 there will be a vote in the Assembly, or there will be a vote by MLAs on whether to retain the key elements of the protocol, particularly notably those around the free movement of goods. So the customs and the regulatory alignment dimensions of the protocol will come up for a vote in the Assembly in 2024, as will the issue the arrangements for the single electricity market. That will be included as well. So it's going to be really interesting to see what happens then, because the default position is if they don't get approved, if the protocol does not get endorsed by MLAs, then we'll be back to the question about what happens to the border on the island of Ireland. Okay, I see a couple more questions coming in. On the Irish government facilitating Northern Ireland students on Erasmus, how would that work, or is it still a goodwill aspiration? I think we're yet to see the detail on that. There's certainly been a commitment by Simon Coveney to ensure that students attending universities in Northern Ireland can continue to benefit from Erasmus. We're probably not going to see that detail until we have a definitive position as to whether the UK is going to be part of that, of Erasmus or not. And have there been any developments on Irish passport holders in Northern Ireland accessing healthcare in Europe, namely via the EHIC card?
Yes, so again, we yet to see the full details of it, but it's important to state that this is all eligible residents in NI, so it's not just Irish passport holders. That would be that the Irish government is committed to having some arrangement. It wouldn't be like holding a card, it would be something a bit different to that, but it would enable those normally resident in Northern Ireland to have the equivalent of those protections when in the EU.
So yeah, I think we'll see more detail on that in due course. Okay, all right. And if there are no more questions, I don't know, Katie, Vivian, do you want to issue your last parting words at the Brexit clinic in 2020 while the UK is still in the transition process? Vivian, do you want to go first? The view from France.
The view from France. Well, the weather is.
Well, the weeds behind you, I think.
Yeah. I guess when you started the Brexit clinics back in 2016, I didn't expect us to still be doing Brexit clinics at the end of 2020. And I think we're going to need a lot more Brexit clinics in the years ahead, which I'm not sure how I feel about that, but I think Brexit is here to stay. And even if we are beyond the transition period, especially with this whole idea of, the protocol as a living document and all the tensions of managing both that intra-UK and UK-EU divergence is going to be there for the foreseeable future.
Katie?
Part of me wants to apologize for ever thinking that we could be logical and rational and say, these are the deadlines, this will definitely happen by this point. Because we should have learned by now that, of course, on the 15th of December, with a few days to go, we'll still have many known unknowns. But I think I just want to pay tribute to David and to Kevin for organising these, and also to everybody who's attended, because there is a real sense of us all trying to have this very steep learning curve and continually updating information. And this is the only way to try and manage the huge change that Brexit is. So thank you for attending, everybody, and for sharing the information. And I'm sure we'll maintain it into the coming years. It becomes even more important in funny ways.
Okay, thanks very much, Katie. I think, Denise, you've asked, hope you're considering these clinics in 2021. We definitely are. We're going to be running a number of projects over the coming years, looking at the implementation of the protocol, and we've certainly committed to running these because we find them particularly valuable to get a sense of some of the questions which are crossing your minds. But also, I think it's a really useful forum for us to be able to sort of share at least the insights we have on what's happening, and hopefully contribute to a better understanding of what is a hugely complex process with a huge number of unknowns. And I think the only way we can begin to understand it is if we sort of collectively share what we do know about the process in an informed manner as possible. Okay, so going to bring today to a close. Say this isn't the last Brexit clinic. We'll be back in the new year. Plenty of questions then to be answered. I think it just leaves me to say thank you to Vivian, thanks to Katie, and for Kevin behind the scenes for putting everything together, and then to yourselves for contributing, for turning up, for participating. Wish you all a best for the Christmas period, and yeah, keep an eye on what's going to be happening on the 1st of January, and also maybe a few developments between now and then. So thanks very much indeed, and I wish everybody well.
Thank you.